Right, we're back. It's Project Natter. Joining me is Nick Margerrison. He's a former LBC presenter and a co-presenter on Talk to Me Radio. How we doing, Nick?
Good. How are you, man?
Yeah, very well. Living the dream, brother. Thanks for taking the time to join us, and a big shout out to Nick for setting this up. So yeah, like I just said, you're a former presenter of LBC and a co-host on Talk to Me Radio. So before we get started, just tell us a little bit about your background and your radio career.
Okay, so I got into radio doing sort of, I guess what you would say was like a poor man's Chris Moyles type act. And I was playing music and that kind of stuff. And I wasn't interested in politics particularly. And then 9/11 happened. And around that point, it started to feel like doing the kind of radio that I was doing wasn't interesting. And I wanted to talk about the real world a little bit more. So I did that, and I got involved in news and current affairs. And I was doing kind of phone-in shows late at night up north that no one really, have listened to. I mean, I had a biggish audience, but no one nationally particularly was listening to them. And they were fun, but I was often saying things to get a response. So I'd go on air and, put a point of view across and get calls and so on. And then things moved on, and I went and worked at a radio station called Kerrang, which I then got into trying to say things that I actually believed in, which which changed how it all worked. And then I got noted in the industry. People started to like what I was doing. I was seen as someone who might win awards and that kind of thing. And so I got a job on LBC. And at that point, I was doing news and current affairs overnight. So it was weekend overnights. And so not the highest profile job on there, but it was fun. And I tried to develop even further this idea of working out what I actually thought about something and then saying what I thought about it. And I did quite well. We got a 23% audience share, which means that approximately a quarter of people who were listening to the radio at that time of night were listening to me. And that was all fun, but also the more honest I was becoming on the radio, the more difficult it was to make that fit LBC. And so we had a parting of the ways. But in the background, I'd always had a concern. So let me say this, David. When I got involved in radio, it was in the late 90s, right? A long time ago now, years ago. And I remember watching some streaming video just as I'd got into the radio industry, and I saw this streaming video. It wasn't YouTube, it was something like a fail blog or something like that. Point was, it was television. I was watching it and it was coming from America. And I realized then that a license to broadcast was becoming worth less compared to the global communication system, the internet, that was dawning upon us. So I'd always been concerned about that. And when I left LBC, it became my business to try to find a way to make a reasonable living doing podcasts or video or something online. And that's how I came to work with John Gaunt on a radio station called Talk to Me Radio. And I would suggest perhaps at that point, I began to maybe get mischaracterized. John Gaunt is quite a right-wing radio presenter. I'm not right-wing. I believe you have to have two wings to fly. So I've got a mixed bag of politics. And yeah, I guess that's where I am now. So I have a little personal podcast that I do that people can check out. Maybe you can put a link to it. And there's a nice little archive there, and it's soon to return with another series where I talk about the esoteric and tie it into politics and the world and so on.
Nice. Yeah, make sure you send a link over. I'll post that below in the comments. So we just want to touch on Russia, Ukraine. As we had a chat just before we started recording. I've seen you've posted quite a bit of this on Twitter. So what are your thoughts so far on what's been happening?
Well, I'm a big fan of what people call maybe logic. So what that means is that I like to not conclude on anything, and I always have the possibility open that whatever it is I currently think, I may be completely wrong. So the opposite of what I think might be the case. And I also like to hear both as many different points of view as I can on any particular topic. And that makes it a little bit tricky, because to context this, David, what's just happened is we've come from COVID-19, where we've been told a bunch of stuff, some of which was true, some of which deeply questionable. And anyone who said maybe was immediately seen as an anti-vaxxer. We've stumbled from that into now a global crisis, which has been brewing for a long time, by the way. So it's a story that I'm not an expert on it, but it's certainly something I've been tracking since at least 2014. And so how does maybe logic fit into that? That becomes the question. How do people who are like me and don't like to take a firm view on either side, how do we react to it? And well, it turns out that a lot of the points of view that are being pushed by the Russians aren't completely baseless. So there are claims about Nazis in the Ukraine, and the BBC did a documentary, actually a brilliant documentary about Nazis in the Ukraine. And then only recently I've seen a BBC reporter doing a live piece, which I wish I'd recorded, where they explained that the Nazi claims that Putin was pushing are baseless. Well, that's not true, according to the BBC. So we've got a contradiction appearing there. So too for a number of other media organizations, Sky News pushing the same line. Yeah, I believe they're connected to Vice, who also did a brilliant documentary about Nazis in Ukraine. And remember, what I'm saying here is maybe. So I'm not saying that I'm pro-Putin, so certainly not. I think he's a terrifying character. But at the same time, I wouldn't say I was pro-Ukraine either. I don't want people to die, obviously not. And I'm not a statesman, but when asked for my opinion, I think it's worth trying to look at both points of view. So it's disappointing that people are now censoring points of view, because the one thing that I've tried to stand by throughout most of my career is free speech. I'm a big fan of people being able to speak and say whatever it is they want to be able to say. And I'm happy to call people an idiot and not agree with them and so on. But it seems a shame if I don't get that opportunity and we don't get to hear what people got to say. So it's rather scary, isn't it, to watch as we see a government sort of censoring points of view in a way similar to the way in which they did with COVID, yet around a matter upon which they want us to take a view. So there's a push, I think, from a number of senior politicians, particularly on social media, that we should want, for example, NATO to close the sky. That was a trending hashtag on Instagram, NATO close the sky. Well, that could trigger a world war. The consequences of that would be huge. Should we support it? And how do we support it if we can't trust the information that we're being given about it, which I don't believe we can?
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because, Putin said anyone who implements this no-fly zone, he's going to see them as, as an act of war, basically getting involved with that. And we've seen quite a few politicians and journalists trying to push for that as well. And you're right there as well. It's hard, you have to take the King Solomon approach, I call it. You have to listen to both sides of the story, and somewhere down the middle is the truth. It's a very difficult one. I've got friends who are Russian and Ukrainian, and actually I was talking to someone earlier, and a family have gone missing. So you're treading on eggshells with what you can and can't say. A lot of people.
I'll tell you what. Let me give you a thought on this, because I'd love to hear what you think on this, because I suspect you and I have pretty different political opinions, and you've got I think you're the organizer of the Heritage Party. You've got a Union Jack in the background. I've always been very skeptical of nationalism. I am British, and I prefer by a country mile to be British to English, because I think that Britain has a better track record on what it stands for personally. But I've always been skeptical of it. And the reason for that is because I had relatives, grandparents who fought in the war, and they were conscripted. They didn't have a choice. I'm not from a military family. And they were not, I didn't get the impression that was a good idea, the Second World War. I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of it, but I don't think it did people a lot of good. And then when I was younger, I went to quite a sort of rough school. I won't name it, but it was a rough school. It's what they call one of these ones where they get squaddies and cannon fodder and people signing up for the army at the school. And I was known for talking people out of joining the army. And I used to always say, well, what if they sent you off to fight a war? And the perception was that there wouldn't be one. And then, of course, we invaded Iraq. And I marched against that. I wouldn't be surprised if you did as well, David. Yeah, a lot.
I did, yeah.
So A lot of people who classify themselves as patriotic marched against that.
Yeah.
And yet there was an interesting change in our culture. So the emblem you have in the background, the Union Jack you've got in the background there on your screen, that used to be kind of a fun thing that Oasis had on their guitars, and Britpop was around. And like I say, I'm from the 90s. I remember all that. And it meant one thing. And then after the war in Iraq, it meant something different, because symbols do change their meaning. And that's one of the problems we've got, isn't it? If there was a war, how many of the people who are watching this would want to fight in it?
Yeah, you're right. And we've seen that in Ukraine. We saw with the sub-Saharan Africans that were interviewed out there, asking them, about it, would they were asked to stay and fight, and they said, why would we stay and fight? We're black, we're not Ukrainian.
We are going to give you guns and you're going to fight for Ukraine. I said, hi, we're going to fight for Ukraine? We are not Ukrainian, we are black. So how can we fight? How can we fight for Ukraine?
So that is a big thing, and who would want to get involved? And you're right about the Iraq War. I was, for a while, I was pretty much left wing myself, and I heard more and more about socialism and communism, and I just despised the whole idea. And I met a lot of people that despised our country and everybody, so it drove me a little bit more to the centre. And I'll tell you now, I'm more centre right than anything. But I suppose politics has shifted so far left over the past 20 years. Anyone that was centred is now seen as far right. It's one of those. But yeah, I marched against the Iraq War as well. And I was going to sign up. Actually, me and my friend William at the time were looking to join the army. And when the Iraq War happened, we decided not to join, because obviously we didn't find that. We didn't agree with the war. So. Yeah, that being said, but then would you, if we was being invaded here, would you strap up your boots?
That's kind of a meaningless question, really, isn't it? I mean, we're an island, so we've never had to contend with these sorts of things. If someone's breaking into my house, then I'm going to hit them. Right, I'm going to attempt to. Right, but like I say, it's a slightly meaningless question, and the problem with it is it's so vague and blurred, that question. Where the lines are blurred, surely they're crossed. And so what happens is people use that kind of rhetorical device when they go, oh, well, someone's invading our house, we need to defend ourselves and all that kind of stuff, to justify appalling crimes, to justify murder, to send people who've got no business being in other countries to go and kill people. And then they come back with terrible, terrible scars to their mental health. Like, I knew someone who had been I knew someone who'd been in a war, right? And they'd won a medal, and someone had thrown a grenade at them, and they picked it up and thrown it back. And when I first heard the story, I was delighted at the heroism, and I was excited by it, because I was an idiot. I was about 8-9 years old, and I was thinking about things like Star Wars, where you kill a bunch of stormtroopers and shout woo as you do it. But I remember the story being told, and this person sort of looked off into the distance and said, yeah, but they died. The people who the grenade was thrown back at. And, the noise of that, the smell of that, the reality of that, it's not something that I'm happy to say, oh, yeah, I'd go and defend Ukraine, or I'd go and defend France, or I'd go and defend anywhere other than specifically the border of this island.
Yeah.
And so this is the thing, is that I'm saying to you that I think there's a lot of people who you may share opinions with, who may actually come away thinking, yeah, but I'm not into nationalism. I don't believe in these ideas. That flag in the background represents other stuff to me. I don't know. I mean, recently I've been looking into empire, and I was looking into a guy called Louis Mountbatten. Have you ever heard of him? Lord Louis Mountbatten, right? So he's quite a fruity aristocrat, for people that don't know. And on YouTube, there's a really interesting series about his life. And it's everything that makes me feel being British is a questionable thing. I'm not proud of that. I watch people like that and I think, ye gods, that's not me or anyone I know. Yeah, it's not a working class point of view. And that's where I'm coming from, really. I've done all right in the media. So I don't know if you could argue I was working class in that sense. It's not really working in the media, but that's my background. That's where I'm coming from. And a lot of these ideas fill me with horror because they're ideas from the past and they don't work anymore. So I was listening, I can't remember the name, but apparently there's this academic I was listening to who inspired Putin. And I wish I had the name off the top of my head, but I was listening to this talk last night, and he was arguing against historicism, the idea that we should go back to where we used to be. Because if we do that, we'll end up where we are now. So the problems of the past cause the realities of the now. And so I'm intrigued by new ideas and new ways of approaching things. And unfortunately, it appears that we are going back into the past because we now have the biggest ground force invasion of a country we've ever seen in Europe happening. And it's a territory dispute, if we look at it really. I mean, the point of view from Putin and Russia is that NATO is effectively a country that's getting closer to its borders. And little fact for anyone who's not aware, the reason we used to call it the Ukraine is because it means borderland. So it's the borderland. It's the borderland between us and Russia. And we're getting closer to it. And so there's a territory dispute. So it's the oldest possible reason for a war. And it doesn't seem like there are many calm voices, David. There aren't many people saying, oh, we need to calm down, not in positions of power anyway. You have Biden, Kamala Harris, Boris Johnson as well. Everyone's very happy to be Beatty. We're all proud of the fact that we're supplying weapons and so on. We're all bracing ourselves for a massive economic collapse. And from my point of view, partly that is down to this idea of nationalism, this idea that there are nations and we're all fighting each other, and isn't it a good thing? What do you think?
Well, I like the idea of having nations because we've all got different, ways of doing things and thoughts and stuff, and different cultures and stuff like that. And we've seen here, the clashes of different cultures and stuff like that. If you was to pick up now, pack up and move to Saudi Arabia, you wouldn't probably agree with the way they live and the way they do things or whatever. So that's, for me, I think I value the way our culture, our identity, who we are. Proud to be an open. I mean, don't take the wrong way. I'm not like some far right geezer or something like that. I'm just proud of our heritage, proud of who we are. Our history goes back, and I think that we should preserve that. And otherwise, it would be lost. When we see now with the BBC doing documentaries, and there's a quite they get twisted. History gets twisted, doesn't it? But anyway, I mean that's my thoughts on it. It's just basically being preserving heritage and history and whatnot. That's why I joined the Heritage Party. I didn't like the idea of statues being pulled down, because you don't like the person from 400 or 500 years ago, whatever it is.
Yeah, so let me come in on that. So my point of view on that would be different. And like I say, I suspect we have more in common than we have in different, but it's interesting to explore the differences. So that idea of tearing down statues, from my point of view, personally, oh yeah, pull them down. Churchill, all these kind of people, they're the people that sent our relatives into war. Yeah, pull them down. Baden-Powell, all these kind of, they're all militaristic people as well. Hoy them into the sea. Right? I'm not interested in preserving that particularly. If people want to preserve it, that's up to them. And I wouldn't pull them down either. But I felt manipulated by social media on that one. I felt that the algorithms that dictate social media were trying to make me have an opinion on that. Right now, that might be me being paranoid, but I really felt that I was being goaded into saying, "Oh, don't pull down this statue of Churchill," and so on. But that's not the Britain that I support. The Britain that I support is the world that I live in and the people that I know. It's not the people that rule us and boss us around and tell us what to do. And it's not these people on statues either who walk around with guns and took people that I'm related to into war. No way. They're the worst of our lot by a country mile. So the reason that I guess
do you think with regards to Second World War then, do you think that we should have just sat back and let the Nazis, get close? They got to France and then just let them invade it?
Well, I don't know because I wasn't there. So if I'd have been there and if I'd have had access to all the facts, maybe, I would have had a different view on it. I really don't know the answer to that. And that's a question that's beyond me. But what I would say is you've hit the the key thing that I would say in defense of the notion of nations is that I interviewed a guy once called Alex Jones, who's quite famous nowadays, InfoWars, that guy. And back then he was seen as kind of a quirky conspiracy theorist, but we were chatting on Kerrang. And I said to him, what's so great about nations? And he gave me the most bulletproof argument in their favor, which is that they act as a firewall against tyranny. They stop tyranny. And that's what was happening, wasn't it? Adolf Hitler was a National Socialist. Problem with socialism, the problem with socialism is in the end, you run out of other people's money. So it's expansive. It has to be. So you have to steal money from other people and expand and take, and conquer. And what was stopping that was the concept of nationhood. So they act as a firewall against tyranny. But like I say, I find it very, very hard to be unreservedly proud, specifically of our country's history. I mean, the British Empire, that's not great. The Atlantic slave trade, that's not great. We did well to fight a war to cancel slavery afterwards. But, we're talking about an ambiguous history here. And I'm a fan of the old saying, what is it? Pride cometh before a fall, right? So I like to not be too proud of too much, really.
No, great.
Am I making sense?
Yeah, no, yeah, I get it. Yeah, you make it. Yeah. To the Ukraine thing. So we discussed on. Well, you just touched on there, Alex Jones, and I was going to ask you about this to see what your views were on this. So Alex Jones a few weeks ago was on one of his live shows was suggesting that there was viral labs in Ukraine, and basically that's why Russia were going in and they were seizing these labs with these viruses in, etc. Just recently there was a video, I don't know if you see it, it was I think it was in America, there was a lady, a congresswoman I believe, talking about it then. So he seems to be, again, so he comes across as a conspiracy theorist, but then some of the stuff he says does come to light. What do you reckon on that theory that Russia have gone into Ukraine because of these viral labs?
Yeah, I've just been reading about that, and none of it is straightforward again, is it? I mean, there are apparently bio research labs in Ukraine. Their purpose is debated. So Russia says that they're weapons, they're for weapons, and we're saying they're for research. And I don't know. I don't believe either point of view, but what's really frustrating about these things is I've had that dismissed out of hand. So people have gone, oh, there's no truth in that whatsoever. And then, like you say, this video has come to light with someone being interviewed, I think, at the Senate.
Does Ukraine have chemical or biological weapons?
Ukraine has biological research facilities, which, in fact, we are now quite concerned Russian forces may be seeking to gain control of. So we are working with the Ukrainians on how they can prevent any of those research materials from falling into the hands of Russian forces.
Which appears to back that point of view up. And also, I mean, bioweapons research was outlawed a long time ago, and it was something that people, all agreed they weren't going to do. And then as soon as they agreed they weren't going to do it, they started doing it, and it's been progressing since then. And one of the concerns with it is how cheap it is. So unlike nuclear firepower, you don't really need that much to get a bioweapon off the ground. And these things in the hands of terrorists and, non-state actors are also a serious possibility. And so it ties into something called gain of function research. Have you heard about this?
No.
Right. Okay. So gain of function research is where you have, and this is in my COD version, but that's the key term to look up on DuckDuckGo, gain of function research. But the idea goes that you have a virus that you understand will gain function rather than lose it over time. So generally viruses start off super virulent and then they become less virulent as they adapt to the human body and the environment. However, you can make some viruses that start off not so serious and they get worse as time goes on. So there's, if you look into this, and again, put Dr. Fauci in when you're looking on DuckDuckGo, gain of function research, what you start to find out is that one of the concerns that people had when COVID came out is that it may have been a gain of function bioweapon. And from some people's point of view, the jury's still out on that. whether or not it was going to become more or less virulent. So we've had the Omicron version recently, which was less dangerous, but seemed to spread quicker. And there's the vague, but becoming more vague possibility that it could have got worse. It accounts for, though, in my opinion, the fear that these guys had, because they were absolutely terrified. The politicians appeared initially, and a lot of the experts appeared terrified. It's only as the crisis settled in and they tried to work out how to manage it that we started having parties and they were all having fun. Initially, there was a lot of fear around, and I suspect that might be because the link to the Wuhan lab, which I'm not sure anymore, David, if that's a conspiracy theory or just accepted as a fact. But those kinds of claims relate to the possibility of a bio war breaking out. And when I first started looking into that, I thought all of that was absolute nonsense. But use some of those search terms, do your own research, and welcome to a rabbit hole.
Yeah, it's a deep hole, that one. Yeah, it's just, like I said, with Alex Jones, as you mentioned there, he's spoken about this. He seems to be ahead of the game a lot of the time. He was saying about war in February. He was talking about this in November. So yeah, people should definitely look at that one, because that's as you said, it was spoken. It was in the Senate, actually, wasn't it? They spoke about it there.
Let me give you an opinion on that. I'll give you a quick opinion on that. I've got a theory on that, and you may find this with what you're doing, and it's happening to a lot of people nowadays. When I first started working in radio, when I was telling you earlier on, I started off and I was doing silly phone-in shows where I'd say one thing, argue my point, other people would argue against me. I opened the phone lines and I took any call that came in. And one of the things that starts to happen is you start to hear other points of view that aren't in the media that make sense, right? And you get lots and lots of different points of view and perspectives, and some of them are balmy and you may be seduced by them and just turn out you're wrong. But others add up to a point of view where governments aren't really nice people. They're more akin to gangsters. And what's interesting to me is that I feel by doing a phone-in show that I had access to social media ahead of everyone else, in a sense. So I was doing it in the 90s, early noughties. Not many people were on Twitter or Facebook at that point. And if they were, they didn't have big audiences. And so all I happened to do is see these pictures that other people are now seeing as they sit in their front room tweeting whilst they're watching X Factor, and they read their replies and they get lots of different points of view. And that's happening en masse now. But it happened to people generally who worked in the media, who worked in journalism, who did that, who opened the phone lines and took any point of view. So they didn't filter, they didn't censor, just let a load of people talk. And it initially is nonsense, but like looking at one of those old 3D pictures, or maybe like watching a static on an old black and white television, and it gradually tunes in, it gradually starts to make a picture. It'll only go for a few seconds and then it goes off again. And if you chase those pictures, what I find you start to get is a low resolution view of the future. So Alex Jones has a massive audience, right? And people wonder, well, where are his contacts? Where are his sources? And he does have contacts and sources. I know that for certain. But also, a lot of it comes from just reading the comments. Sit down, read the comments. What have people got to say? And when you do that, they lead you into places that then turn out to be true. So, Bitcoin, for example, that was around back in 2012. Everyone knew about it, who was into the alternative media. Then, false flag attacks. They were recently, America was talking about them in relation to Russia and saying that Russia was planning one in Ukraine. Well, anyone who's listened to Alex Jones already knows what a false flag attack is and has got probably a detailed history of it if they've really got into his work. So you get this low resolution view of the future on the fringes of society. And sometimes these things come to pass. So I think that's why it's hard to take a position on, the straightforward support Ukraine, isn't it great? Let's have a no-fly zone questions, because we are all aware that the world is more complicated than we were led to believe when we were younger.
Yeah, you're right. It is very, very complicated. As I was saying, you have to take the King Solomon approach. There's always two sides to every story. Somewhere in the middle is the truth. You touched again with Alex Jones. The World Economic Forum, I think they posted a video it was last year. One of the things was, you'll own nothing and you'll be happier. Recently, Boris Johnson has pushed through a law. I believe it's been pushed through already through Parliament, to take people's assets away. So they're talking about Russian oligarchs and whatnot here, and to seize their assets. And obviously, this law won't just be, subject just to Russians, would it? This will be for, pretty much everywhere else. So I think that's something to keep our eyes on.
Yeah, I'm not fully across that story. I've seen some heat about it on Twitter, but I've not seen it from an official source yet. Literally in the last 5 minutes, I think I've just been looking at that. However, to take the point that you're making, I'm not so excited about seeing Russians having their assets seized, because it seems to me to be the case that anyone who, for example, voted Brexit or was unsure about COVID and has been cast as a consequence as someone who is under the influence of Russian propaganda, we're next, right? The flat reality will be they'll say, oh, well, what about this David guy? He was affected by Russian propaganda supporting Brexit. How's he doing financially? Oh, maybe we should repossess some of his assets. It's not that far away. And it's something that's pretty concerning, because at the moment we're going to face a massive crisis, because if you're doing okay financially and, you think driving and cutting back on fuel and stuff isn't a big deal, you can afford a little bit extra to save the world. That's one thing. So the middle class point of view, but a lot of people that I know, that's not possible. They live hand to mouth. They earn their money, they spend their money. That's it. They haven't got any savings and they've probably got debt. Yeah. So if we're about to head into a major financial crisis, they will need to fund that somehow, and seizing assets seems to be a good way of doing that. And bear in mind that broadly my view on these is that they're kind of, it's legalized gangsterism politics, really. And so I wouldn't put it past them that might be the way that it goes. I'd be concerned about it.
Do you think there'll be some sort of social credit score? We keep hearing this from the likes of Alex Jones, for example, and we know they've got it in China, and pretty much what you were just saying there would fit into that narrative. Can you see that happening here?
Well, there's a book that the World Economic Forum published. There's two, in fact. There's COVID-19, The Great Reset. That's fun, but a bit depressing. And yet before that, there's a better book that they published that's more interesting, and it's called The Fourth Industrial Revolution. And I think it was 2016 they published it, and I got a copy of it and read it because I'm a fan of conspiracy theories and it sounded right up my alley. And sure enough, I think page 23, they talk about microchipping people. And that was always a big thing in the conspiracy theory world, by the way. So I remember back in the 1980s seeing an Alex Jones-like person saying that we were all going to get microchipped. And I thought that was hilarious. And I'm a big fan of sci-fi. So I remember Googling those sorts of things in the 90s and thinking, how silly. And then I'm holding a book in 2016, published by the World Economic Forum, a serious organization, by the way. They organize Davos and so on. And page 23, they just casually toss aside the fact that, yeah, of course we'll put RFID chips in people. That's really concerning, because it almost flatters them to call them gangsters. There's another point of view, and this is from our heritage. It's George Orwell, Animal Farm. We're animals on a farm, right? That's what we're. And if you're proud of that, that's one thing, but I'm not sure I'm proud of the farmers. And if we're animals on a farm, well, that's how they're treated, aren't they? They have little microchips stuck into them and so on. And a lot of that would be very appealing to the billionaire class, I'm sure, because then you could have your nice little VIP get-togethers, which is, again, VIP, very important person, central part of our culture for a long time. I've always hated it, such nonsense. But you go, okay, so this is the VIP areas. Everyone here is a billionaire. They've all been vaccinated. And we know that because we've all got microchips on us. Now, that's used to seem ridiculous. And I'm still attuned to that because it is bizarre. And I'm aware of the fact that a lot of people listening to this will be like, oh, they've gone mental now. This is crazy stuff. But it is being discussed. And people need to be across that and be aware of the dangers, because the dangers are enormous. And we're seeing them now. People are having their bank accounts switched off, frozen and attacked, not just in Russia, but over in Canada. Of course, you have these protests happening. You have Justin Trudeau asking whether or not we should tolerate these people, meaning people that were against COVID-19 vaccinations. Now, yes, we should tolerate these people because we're supposed to be liberal democracies. So absolutely, we should tolerate these. We should tolerate all sorts of people. People we despise and hate, we should tolerate in this country, I believe. But that language is pushing liberalism into a very weird position. And again, I was listening to someone, I wish I knew the name of the academic, but I was listening to it as I went to sleep last night. This person was talking about liberalism has entered into a new stage. So you used to have communism, fascism, and liberalism. Communism and fascism died and liberalism won. But that caused a problem. The problem was that liberals, meaning Enlightenment liberals, not the new version of the word, people in our society started to think that our way was the only way, that was it. There was the end of history had arrived. And that's obviously not true. And it incorporates a linear view of time where we start at A and move through to Z, going through all the letters of the alphabet along the way. But some people think that time's cyclical and we're going around in a circle. And if that's the case, then we've made a number of mistakes because people in the past didn't do things like we're doing them, and they survived. They got through these cycles. And we've adopted a bold new approach to how things should work that might not work. And so as we face the realities of the old world with a massive ground invasion of tanks, and we say, oh yeah, we're going to switch the money off. What are you going to do about that? And they say, well, we'll switch the gas off. How about that? How do you like them apples? So which is more real, money or gas, right? Which is more real, money or food? Well, we're about to find out. And that's rather concerning, isn't it? Because it's a failure of an ideology that we've allowed to assume unquestioned, supremacy, liberal supremacy, none of the other supremacies that people talk about, actually liberal supremacy, this notion that it's the right thing to do to have a liberal society and so on. And I'm not saying it's not, but equally I am saying that we've not fully tested that one yet, and putting all our eggs in that basket, we're going to find out what happens, aren't we?
Yeah, I was about to say, final thoughts, Nick. Where do you see this going from here? What do you reckon will happen? Do you think eventually everyone will sit down at the negotiating table and maybe Russia will take a piece of Ukraine and that'll be the end of it? Or do you think it'll escalate and we'll see China invading Taiwan and and then it exploding from there? What do you reckon?
Well, surely the world order has changed. That's clear. And the behavior of Russia in a global economy and how that is reprimanded is unclear. So let's say the best possible outcome from my point of view is that we do what President Biden, should we say maybe accidentally said, which is if they take a bit of territory, if it's a minor incursion, well, let them get away with it. I don't know if you're familiar with that quote, but that's what Biden said just before it happened. And yeah, I think he's right. If that's what happens, that's what happens. It'd be sad for the people of Ukraine. I don't live in Ukraine. There's not much I can do about it.
In Cyprus,
yeah, it's a better outcome, I think, than the spectacle of intercontinental ballistic missiles and a full-on conflict, because that's what Putin's talking about. And this, as I said before, is a territorial dispute. It's not a trivial matter. It's the sort of thing that wars have been fought over traditionally for many thousands of years. And so backing down seems to me to be the best possible option for NATO. And really, it's partly coming about as a consequence of us subscribing to values that we may or may not have believed in, and appearing weak in the minds of people who don't share our values. So by adopting certain points of view, other people start to think, oh, right, they're not the scary British Empire anymore. They're not the scary American Empire anymore. They're a different version. They probably think we're decadent. And so they go, right, okay, you've taken on board ideas and points of view that make you appear weak, and they're taking advantage of that. And that will force, hopefully, us to reevaluate what we're about to a certain extent. And the beauty of the fact that we live in democracies, and I didn't used to believe in that, David, by the way. I didn't used to think we did live in a democracy. What changed my mind was Brexit. if we do live in a democracy, we can change direction, and we are fluid. And if we're not dogmatic, and we're not sort of tied down to historical notions of what we are, but we start to think about what we can be in the future and adapt to reality as we find it rather than we'd like it to be, potentially everyone could benefit from this in the long term. But I mean, obviously, war is a nasty business, and wars are easy to start, hard to put out. They're like house fires. And let's hope it doesn't spread. So let's say my analysis as a non-expert, my guess is that it'll all blow over, David, and we'll be fine. but I'm aware of the fact that may be not the case, and I loop back to what I told you before about maybe logic. Maybe it'll all blow over and we'll be fine.
Fingers crossed, Nick. Well, thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate you coming on, mate. And we'll post a link below the video to your podcast, so make sure you send that over to us, and we'll get that done. But thanks.
No worries, David.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye bye.